You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host and bourbon-soaked storyteller, Juliette Miranda.
Hi there, y'all. It's Juliette Miranda. Welcome to episode 116 of the Unwritable Rant podcast. I have two bourbon-soaked stories for y'all today about a reluctant friend and hammered resolutions. But first, what do you say we talk about a little bit of whiskey? It's time to fill up those glasses, y'all. Now raise them up, and let's say cheers. Oh, y'all, I have Thanksgiving in a glass right here. I'm drinking a new release, the Basil Hayden Dark Rye. This is considered a specialty whiskey, and it's about as unconventional as it gets. This is a blend of Kentucky and Canadian ryes, plus a port-style wine from California. Now, mind you, this is not aged in a port barrel. It actually has port in it. I really kind of wanted to be able to complain about this whiskey, because I'm starting to feel as though distillers are just going a little too far with their whiskey experimentation. I mean, really, what's coming next? Adding soy sauce to the mash bill? But I can't complain, y'all. I can't, because this dark rye is truly heavenly. It has a very deep, complex flavor. It reminds me a little bit of molasses, with, caramel undertones and definitely black cherry coming to the front. But there's raisin-like sweetness, too. Not so much that this tastes like a dessert, but just enough to kind of mellow out the spiciness of the rye. Now, for me personally, I would like to have just a little bit more spice. Still, this is a really, really fascinating, complex kind of whiskey. Definitely worth it for the holidays. It's only like $40 a bottle. Now that we are all cozy with our cocktails, my big question for y'all today is, how far would you go for a friend? In the past, I have shared several stories about my crazy girlfriend Crazy Town. For as dysfunctional as our wacky connection was, I really did adore her. And that's why, despite all of my better judgment, I would usually join whatever misadventure she proposed, whether it was starting a babysitter's club in her backyard or becoming strippers for bachelor parties. I kind of think we've all had some sort of wild friend in our pasts. But what happens when it turns out that you're the crazy friend? Because Lord knows that would be me, and I'm definitely minus several friends because of it. One girl in particular comes to mind, and for this I will call her Crabapple. We met under conditions of mutual disdain. She had recently divorced her cheating husband, and I was just dumped out of a 3-year relationship with a man whose ex faked cancer to get him back. And if that doesn't sound like the beginning of a Thelma and Louise knockoff, I don't know what would. Disgust over our failed relationships was exactly all Crabapple and I had in common, which for the first 6 months suited us just fine. We commandeered every jilted woman cliché thinkable. There were late-night pizza binges, extravagant shopping excursions, and hours upon hours of conversation where we reassured each other that we were better off. But as much as I appreciated the comfort that we provided each other, my wallowing was eventually replaced by restlessness. And it is here where the disparity in our personalities became grossly evident. I stopped staying in and started going to every bar, concert, and strip club on my radar. This had been my usual routine after every significant breakup. Sure, it sounds tremendously unhealthy, but music and booze and strippers were my safety net of sorts. It just allowed me to blow off steam and feel desirable in an environment that I understood. I had no problem doing any of that alone. Occasionally, I would bring along a like-minded friend, but often Crabapple would insist on tagging along. In hindsight, I probably should have given her better warning about what my depravity entailed, because she always had a miserable time. And I get it, believe me. I never insisted that Crabapple join me. I always gave her an out, but she never took it. She always wanted in, if for no other reason than to make sure I didn't wind up chained to a furnace in someone's basement. Which was a little ironic because we actually did wind up in some random musician's basement one night. We were somewhere between Indianapolis and Chicago. Geographically speaking, this is not the most desirable location, especially after dark. But I had hauled us out there to see some tragically fading hair band that I knew from Los Angeles, and about an hour into the 5-hour drive home, my car had a meltdown. This was my Chevy, a car that was so dramatically unreliable and unpredictable that the speedometer would randomly seize up in the middle of a drive, leaving me to guess my speed by how fast objects whizzed past my windows. So we were barreling down I-65 when my engine temperature indicator shot well beyond the red. To that point, I had been under white line hypnosis. I was too wired from energy drinks to fall asleep, but too tired from an exhausting night of watching Crabapple eye roll her way through the concert that I couldn't really do much beyond stare at the road. Although, to be completely honest, I was so annoyed. Crabapple had initially seemed enthusiastic about going to the show, but the minute we arrived and met up with the band, she took on the temperament of an adolescent who has listened to one too many emo songs. She spent the early part of the night in the band's dressing room reading. She refused to talk to anyone and eventually slunk out to her seat in the arena as if it were a waiting room for the gas chamber. We really hadn't spoken much since getting in the car, and as far as I could tell, she had spent the ride dozing off in the passenger seat. The angry buzzing of my dashboard jolted both of us out of our bothered silence. I was so startled that I swerved wildly to the right, fearing, and not entirely irrationally, that my car was on the verge of explosion. Crabapple is yelling at me to slow down, but as we bumped over the shoulder, I just lost all ability to control my car, and we wound up thumping right into a ditch. My dashboard looked like the switchboard at a psychiatric ward. According to my car, everything was wrong. I had no tire pressure, my coolant reservoir was dry, and who the hell knew why my check engine light was blinking? It had never done that before. We were both freaked out, but not hurt. I get out to survey the situation, and am relieved to see that my car hasn't sustained any noticeable damage. Oddly, there wasn't any steam coming from the engine, which led me to wonder if the blaring warning light was just another one of my car's playful parlor tricks. That didn't change the fact that we were fucked, of course. There was no way I was getting out of that ditch without a tow truck. All right, this was all my fault. I could not deny that. Were it not for my sick fascination with music, we wouldn't be up to our knees in dying prairie grass and dirt. But really, there was no need to panic. I'd been in far worse situations than this. Crabapple has her hands on her hips and is glaring at me. She's not pleased. She wants to call her dad, who lived about 2 hours away in Fort Wayne. But goddammit, I was a grown woman in my early 30s. There was no way I was letting some girl's dad come to our rescue. Besides, I had a better idea. The hallmark of a truly good wild gal, and I learned this from Crazy Town, is to always have options. A musician I had once dated lived about 30 minutes away or so near Indiana Beach. We had stayed loosely in contact through the years. Not exactly as friends, but more like mutual backup plans. This situation didn't quite meet the benefits arrangement that I had with a guy, but I was fairly confident I could sweet-talk him into helping us out. I explained my brilliant idea to Crabapple, who rolls her eyes and asks, Just how many musicians do you know? It turns out I knew at least one who was more than happy to give us a hand. Finally, a musician who proves himself to be useful. He saved us a cab ride and picked us up himself, taking us back to his kinda shady, kinda sketchy house for the night. Now, out of respect to Crabapple, I turned down his offer to share his bed. I instead spent the night wrapped up in a musty blanket on his basement floor, next to Crabapple, who got the sofa. Admittedly, the house didn't have any toilet paper, and the basement reeked of pot and sweaty socks. But it beat the hell out of hanging out on the side of an Indiana highway waiting for Crabapple's dad to show up. Although judging by the annoyed sighs she let out every couple of minutes, I think it's safe to say Crabapple didn't exactly share my perspective. We eventually made it home the next day, but the night had taken its toll. Crabapple started instituting all sorts of conditions on our friendship, kind of in an attempt to contain my wild streak. Gone were the nights of crossing state lines to hunt down some band I kinda sorta knew from a decade ago. Strip clubs were out of the question, and booze, forbidden. Crabapple also, and rightfully, started insisting that she drive everywhere. Alright, so here's the thing, y'all. I felt terrible about that whole ordeal in Indiana, so for a while I played the part of a model friend. Because I really did want to make an effort for us as friends. So I joined her for movie nights and afternoons exploring craft fairs. But when the big thrill of a Saturday night was a 9 p.m. run for ice cream, let's just say that my rock club habit kind of had me scratching at my arms like a junkie. So I broke the news to Crabapple as gently as I could. This all-or-nothing friendship was not working for me. There was a new band playing at a bar near my apartment that following Friday night. That meant I would not be going over to her house for pizza and Scrabble. Crabapple was welcome to join me if she wanted, but only with the understanding that I was excited about meeting the band and that I would very likely be drinking. If that sounds a bit harsh or a little like an uninvitation, it was only because I wanted her to know exactly what the night would involve. That way, she could own it and make a decision about whether or not she wanted to go. So I have no idea, no clue in the world why Crabapple decided she wanted to join me. Maybe she really did enjoy our friendship and wanted to make an effort of it too. Maybe she felt bad about all the mom guilt she had heaped on me over the past month. And then, maybe she just had second thoughts about the whole thing. It was not a good night for us, despite my best efforts. I made sure we had a table so that Crabapple wouldn't have to battle drunks and a bar stool. I even ordered her one of those stupid fruity cocktails that no bartender on the planet likes to make, hoping maybe that it would mellow her out a little bit. Hell, even the band tried to be nice to her. The bass player bought her a giant plate of nachos. She barely picked at it. Crabapple just sat there and sulked and buried her nose in her phone like a bored parent at a talent show. It was clear she did not want to be there. As for me, well, once I accepted that Crabapple was not going to be good company, I promptly ditched her and made friends with the beer tub girl. She and I were dancing flirtatiously in front of that handsome bass player when Crabapple taps me on the shoulder. She wants to go home and wants me to come with her. For the majority of my life, I have operated under a friends stick together kind of mindset. And I have ended countless perfectly lovely evenings just to make sure that a friend that I arrived with didn't have to go home alone. But Crabapple had positioned herself as less and less of a friend and more as my keeper, and I was done. I told her that I would be taking a cab and resumed dancing with the beer girl. The next morning, I awoke to a tersely worded email from Crabapple. In it, she lectured me about my bad habits and obsession with musicians. She positioned this as just being concerned about my well-being, but her point was clear. if I wanted to remain her friend, the musicians and otherwise would need to cease. I didn't respond. Was that shitty of me? The thing is, I just knew it would never work between us. And I'll be totally honest, y'all, I can't say I've ever felt especially broken up about it. I may have lost a reluctant friend, but I did wind up unexpectedly gaining something much, much more. That handsome bass player I was dancing in front of? Yeah, he eventually became my guy. And with that, I am raising up my glass and I am drinking to all of the wild ones out there. And to my guy, who knows just how to let my crazy shine. Cheers, y'all. Whiskey. I can imagine this whiskey just tasting so seriously wonderful right after Thanksgiving. Of course, it is only 80 proof, and if your family is anything like mine, you're probably going to want something a little bit stronger. In thinking about my friendship with Crabapple, I have to admit that I have had some seriously messed up friendships. And truly, I cannot think of a more messed up friendship than the one I had with a guy that I will call Shapeshifter. Many years ago, back when I lived in Los Angeles, I spent a few months on the road with a hairband renaissance tour. The bands were back in demand thanks to the nostalgia of shows like Where Are They Now? And I was a part of a small team handling tour publicity. Shapeshifter was my coworker. My job was securing press coverage, lining up interviews for members of 3 of the bands on the tour, and then making sure they showed up to do them. That meant, on any given day, I had to wrangle 12 musicians across 3 different tour buses, away from their groupies, drugs, sleep, and video games, and then escort them into a conference room or onto the phone for anywhere from 1 to 4 hours of the same mind-numbing questions. Had my college algebra class presented me with that kind of word problem, perhaps I would have been better at my job. As it was, I spent most days on the phone, either with greedy journalists trying to beg extra show tickets off me, or with grumbling tour managers who knew less about where their bands were than their wives did. It was the single most thankless and grueling job I've ever had, but the one thing that kept me from losing my mind entirely was my friendship with Shapeshifter. He was a rakish sort of nerd, a screenwriter, who, like me, took a job in public relations as a way to pay the bills. The tour had thrown us together like an arranged marriage, and we'd gotten incredibly close, incredibly fast. We spent hours together, either driving between gigs or hanging out in the production office, and would use the time to talk. In just 1 month, we knew everything there was to know about each other. I commiserated with him about the frustrations of maintaining his relationship with a girl back in L.A., and he consoled me about my breakup with the warden, a guy who was so possessive and controlling, he needed to approve my hairstylists. Shapeshifter and I really did make a tremendous team, personally and professionally. And I'll tell you, in that environment, it was good to have a friend. Movies like Almost Famous and Rockstar get quite a bit right about the rock and roll tour experience. There really were some days when I would just walk out onto the side of the stage while one of the bands was playing, and I'd just be overcome by the energy in the arena. The band would be playing whatever that one song was that everybody knew and loved, and the room would just be glowing with lighters and beaming smiles. And I would look at all of that and just feel so lucky to be there, and in my own stupid way contributing to it. But here is the reality, y'all. Most days, I dragged. We all did. The band guys, the tour managers, the roadies. The whole idea that bands used their downtime on the road to write albums was complete and total bullshit. Because endless stretches of drudgery do not equal creativity. At best, they induce complacency. And at worst, debauchery. One particularly unfortunate Thanksgiving weekend, the tour was stopped in Utah for a 2-day holiday. And if you think there is anything glamorous about being with a herd of rock stars in Utah, clearly you have never been to Utah. Now, the crew and the bands did have the option of flying home for the holiday, on their own dime, mind you. And those who remained were put up at a shitty hotel just outside of the desert. My parents likely would have happily flown me home, but pride and just general stubbornness kept me there in Utah, where scorpions hiding under the bathroom sink were the least of my problems. That first night, I joined Shapeshifter and other crew members at a nearby restaurant for dinner. It was a good time overall, but I was worn out from the tour, and really more interested in just getting a full night of sleep in an actual bed. I said goodnight, and I wandered back to my room. It was located just a few steps down from the pool, so the whole hallway was filled with musky humidity and the putrid stench of chlorine. I just sighed as I let myself in my room, thinking at the very least I will have some alone time. Except that I didn't, because there, kicking it shirtless on my bed, was a certain guitar player, and he was raging on cocaine. Ugh. There is nothing quite like the frenetic stupidity of a bored musician on cocaine. The guy is looking tremendously pleased at his little surprise. Apparently, he had bribed a maid to let him into my room. He bounces his wiry, too skinny for his own good frame right up to me, plants a kiss on my forehead, and then begins blathering a mile a minute about how he would just love to get into some trouble with me. My whole body just sinks into the floor in frustration. I'm thinking, you have got to be kidding me. He's pacing back and forth in the room like an overzealous fire ant. I can't even be sure he's breathing. There are just too many words coming out of his dumb mouth. He's making plans for our night, saying, oh, let's go to the hot tub, let's hit the bar. And then, of course, the dreamy suggestion of let's fuck. He pulls a little baggie out of his pocket, and to my complete dismay, I see that it is exactly the last thing this situation needs. More coke. He dangles it in front of my eyes and tells me it'll put me in the mood for anything. I was already in the mood to slug him right in his skeletal face, so I didn't really need a bump to help me along. But the last thing I want to do is escalate the situation. Because I would have been screwed either way. Even if, by some disgusting whim, I did want to have sex with the guy, word would get out and I would lose all professional credibility. And if I didn't have sex with him and we got into some sort of altercation, physical or otherwise, I'd still get the blame. The only real option I see for myself is escape. So when this guy's back is turned and he's occupied by his coke, I bolt out the door and sprint to the stairwell and into the lobby. In my frenzied getaway, I bump smack into Shapeshifter. He sees that I'm panicked and pissed off, and immediately understands that this is not the time for casual conversation. He hustles me out a side door and tells me to give him a minute. When he returns, he's got the keys to the production van. Come on, he says, we're going for a drive. He takes us just far enough into the desert to feel like we're away from the world. And for the next hour listens as I just unload. Everything comes out, from having the guitar player break into my room to all of my fears and frustrations and just disgust with the job. Once I've simmered down, Shapeshifter just looks at me and says, "You know you are better than all this." His meaning was plain enough. I knew full well that public relations was not my field. And Lord knows I wasn't cut out for the life of a rock and roll tour. Shapeshifter really didn't need to say anything else. We just sat in the car and stared out at the astoundingly bright desert sky, both of us silenced by the inconvenient intimacy of the moment. The radio crackled in the background. Save Tonight was playing, which is a deceptively upbeat song that I've always felt a little bit of guilty affection for. The cheesy lyrics just washed over me, and for a moment, I allowed myself what I like to call a When Harry Met Sally indulgence. That movie is the epitome of romantic comedies. It haunted my dating years because it instilled in me the unrealistic expectation that I could transform any friendship into a romance with the right words or gesture. I didn't look at Shapeshifter, but I imagined that were I to turn to him, we could kiss. And all the undercurrents of attraction I was feeling could make us a couple, and everything would just be all right. Shapeshifter had a girlfriend, and I had a hell of a lot of issues to work out. And for once, I really didn't want to ruin a friendship. So I snapped the radio off and suggest that we head back to the hotel. 1 week later, I was laid off from that job. Shapeshifter saw me off to the airport, and he reassures me, this is a good thing. We briefly hugged and promised to stay in touch. And we actually did. We stayed really, really good friends for a long time after that, even through my move back to Chicago. Every so often, I still had When Harry Met Sally moments with Shapeshifter, but they lessened over time, and ultimately vanished when I found myself in a new relationship. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for Shapeshifter. His own relationship had ended, and after he related all of the details to me on the phone one night, he paused, and then asks why he and I had never hooked up. The air was heavy after he said that. I had a good 20 different answers to offer, but decided it was best to keep things light. So I say, well, it's mostly because I find you remarkably unattractive and irritating. Shapeshifter laughed, but he was not ready to let it go. And then his tone changes, goes deeper than I'd ever heard it, and he says, I would love to see you naked. Ugh, really? In the course of 5 minutes, he had gone from a half-weepy, jilted guy to an uncanny remake of that coked-out guitar player back in Utah. God damn it. What do you do in a situation like that? Is there a right way to handle it? Because me, I took the easy way out. I made a half-assed joke about just loving a full night of sleep, and I hung up the phone. In movies like When Harry Met Sally, when the antagonist makes a dick-headed move like Shapeshifter did, there's usually a period of contemplation. It's followed by introspection and then resolution. I was more than willing to skip the sweeping gesture portion of the resolution and settle on some awkward laughter and a promise to never speak of such things again. But Shapeshifter had a different plan, and 1 week later it arrived in a box from UPS. It had his return address on it, but there was no note inside. Nope. That box contained just one thing: a digital camera. You know, it may be an unpopular opinion, but to this day, I do not fault Shapeshifter for thinking that we could be more than friends. But I do fault him for not giving me the same courtesy I once gave him. And that's why I took a hammer to that digital camera, and I beat the living hell out of it, and then shipped the pieces right back to him. That gesture, y'all, that resolved everything. Well, I think that is enough out of me, y'all. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Unwritable Rant podcast. And hey, Thanksgiving is coming up, so I hope you all have a very happy one. If you are in need of a bourbon or whiskey to take with you to your family gathering, I have just the suggestions for you. Hit me up on Twitter and I will send you a link to my top 5 favorite bourbons and whiskeys video. I made sure that all of these bourbons and whiskeys are value priced and reasonably easy to find. Of course, I did include one splurge item, but that's just me. Anyway, have a happy one, y'all. I'm going to have some more bourbon, but I will be back to chat with you again next week. Cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablерant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. You can hear new episodes of The Unwritable Rant on radiovegas.rocks every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern and on IPMNation.com on Saturdays and Sundays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and hear best of episodes every weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter at Morning Neurosis.
Girl, you was pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, a couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton relay. Hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweet as taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing tastes better than a bourbon kiss. You can be the flower on my magnolia. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this.